My wife told our colleagues I'd never amount to anything without her connections, then continued dancing with her affair partner while I quietly walked out forever. I probably should have seen it coming, but when you're building satellites that could save lives someday, you tend to focus on solutions rather than problems that shouldn't exist. I'm Zachary, 31, and I design aerospace systems that help emergency responders communicate when everything else fails. It's not glamorous work, but it matters, and I'd always thought Felicia understood that about me. We'd been married for 4 years, together since our graduate school days at the University of Minnesota. She was brilliant, a corporate tax attorney who could navigate complex regulations like I navigated circuit boards, and I genuinely admired her sharp mind and ambition. Our annual company gala was held at the Marriott in downtown Minneapolis, one of those events where everyone dresses up and pretends networking is fun while eating overpriced salmon and making small talk about quarterly projections. I'd been looking forward to it because Felicia had seemed excited about finally meeting my colleagues properly, and I thought it would be good for her to see the innovative work our team was doing. I spent weeks preparing a presentation about our latest emergency satellite communication project, something that could revolutionize how first responders coordinate during natural disasters. The evening started well enough, with Felicia looking stunning in a black dress that cost more than my monthly car payment, working the room like the professional she was. I introduced her to my team leads and project managers, watching her charm them with questions about our work that seemed genuinely interested rather than polite. But about an hour into the cocktail reception, I noticed she kept gravitating toward Marcus, my former business partner who'd left our company 6 months earlier after a disagreement about project directions. Marcus had always been more concerned with flashy presentations and quick profits than sustainable innovation, and his departure had actually improved our team dynamics considerably. I watched them talking by the bar, Felicia laughing at something he said, her hand touching his arm in a way that made my stomach clench with recognition. When I approached to join their conversation, the energy shifted immediately, Marcus smirking like he knew something I didn't, and Felicia stepping slightly closer to him in a way that felt deliberate and territorial. The moment that changed everything came when Dr. Peterson, our division head, approached our group to discuss the potential applications of our new satellite array. I started explaining the technical specifications, genuinely excited to share how our system could reduce emergency response times by 40% in rural areas. But as I talked, I noticed Felicia's expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed irritation, rolling her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. When Dr. Peterson asked about future development timelines, she interrupted with a laugh that cut through the background chatter like breaking glass. She told him that I was always promising revolutionary breakthroughs that never materialized, that my problem was thinking too small and getting bogged down in technical details instead of seeing the bigger picture. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have, not just because of their cruelty, but because of how confidently she delivered them in front of my colleagues. She continued, saying I'd never amount to anything significant without her family's connections in the Minneapolis business community, that my engineering work was just elaborate tinkering, and that Marcus understood how to actually build something worthwhile. Dr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, mumbling something about needing to check on other guests, but the damage was done, and I could see the shift in how my colleagues viewed the interaction. Marcus wrapped his arm around Felicia's waist possessively, and she leaned into him while continuing to explain how I lacked the vision and business acumen necessary for real success. She predicted that within 5 years, I'd still be in the same position, working on the same small projects, while people like Marcus built actual companies that mattered. The ballroom felt like it was spinning, filled with colleagues who'd overheard enough to understand what was happening, their expressions ranging from pity to secondhand embarrassment. I could have argued, could have pointed out that my technical innovations had saved our company millions in development costs, could have explained that my approach prioritized substance over style because real innovation takes time and careful planning. Instead, I walked to our shared table, removed my wedding ring, and placed it next to the centerpiece without saying a word. I collected my coat from the back of my chair, nodded politely to the colleagues who were pretending not to stare, and walked out of the ballroom with my dignity intact. As the elevator doors closed, I could hear Felicia's laughter carrying across the lobby, already moving on with her evening as if dismantling our marriage had been just another networking conversation. The valet brought my car around, and I drove home through the quiet Minneapolis streets, thinking about satellite trajectories and communication protocols because focusing on problems I could actually solve felt better than dwelling on the one I couldn't. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, like returning to a place that had belonged to someone else, filled with shared furniture and photographs that now represented a fiction I'd been living without realizing it. I sat at my desk, surrounded by technical manuals and prototype circuit boards, trying to process what had just happened while my phone buzzed with messages I didn't want to read. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the realization that Felicia had been performing our marriage for months while planning its destruction, treating our relationship like one of her complex tax strategies where the outcome was predetermined and I was just another liability to be managed. I thought about all the evenings I'd come home excited to share breakthrough moments in my research, how she'd listened with what I'd interpreted as genuine interest but now understood was barely concealed impatience. The technical work that energized me, the careful problem-solving that defined who I was, had become evidence of my inadequacy in her eyes rather than proof of my value. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and reviewed the work I'd been doing on emergency communication networks, reminding myself that regardless of what had happened tonight, there were still problems worth solving and innovations worth pursuing. The project we'd been developing could genuinely save lives during natural disasters, helping coordinate rescue efforts when traditional communication systems failed, and that mattered more than office politics. My phone continued buzzing with texts and missed calls, probably from colleagues who'd witnessed the scene and wanted to offer sympathy or gossip, but I turned it off and focused on the technical specifications spread across my desk. Tomorrow I'd have to figure out how to rebuild my personal life, but tonight I could still lose myself in the precise mathematics of orbital mechanics and signal processing algorithms that had always made sense to me in ways that relationships apparently didn't. Within 48 hours, I had systematically dismantled our shared life with the same methodical precision I used to design satellite networks. I'd always been good at logistics and problem-solving, skills that turned out to be surprisingly useful when extracting yourself from a marriage without leaving any loose ends for manipulation or guilt trips. The first step was financial separation, which I accomplished by transferring exactly my contributed portion from our joint accounts, leaving detailed spreadsheets showing every deposit and withdrawal so there could be no confusion about what belonged to whom. Felicia had always handled our social finances while I managed investments and savings, and she'd probably assumed I was too passive to take decisive action about money, but 4 years of engineering project management had taught me the importance of documentation and clear boundaries. I met with our real estate agent Monday morning and offered to sell Felicia my half of our suburban Minneapolis house at current market value, giving her the option to buy me out or list the property for sale within 30 days. The house had been her choice anyway, selected for its proximity to her law firm and the country club where she networked, and I'd never felt particularly attached to the granite countertops and vaulted ceilings that impressed her colleagues. Our agent looked uncomfortable handling what was obviously a divorce transaction disguised as a business deal, but I kept the conversation focused on appraisals and timelines rather than personal drama that wasn't anyone else's concern. By Tuesday afternoon, I'd accepted a transfer to our company's satellite office in Portland, Oregon, something I'd been considering for months anyway since they were developing more innovative emergency communication systems than our Minneapolis headquarters. My supervisor actually seemed pleased about the move, mentioning that the Portland team needed someone with my specific expertise in signal processing algorithms, and the relocation package would cover moving expenses while giving me a fresh start 3 time zones away from the wreckage of my personal life. I spent Wednesday systematically blocking mutual friends on all social media platforms, not out of anger but because I had no interest in becoming the subject of their gossip or receiving unsolicited advice about forgiveness and working things out. These were people who'd watched Felicia humiliate me publicly and done nothing, who would probably spend months analyzing our relationship dynamics and taking sides based on incomplete information, and I simply didn't have the energy to manage their opinions about my choices. The phone number change was surprisingly liberating, like cutting the final thread connecting me to a version of myself I no longer wanted to be, and I programmed the new number into only the essential contacts while instructing my lawyer to handle all divorce-related communications. I hired the most efficient attorney I could find, someone who specialized in clean, uncontested divorces and had no interest in prolonging conflicts for billable hours, giving him clear instructions to finalize everything as quickly as possible without any alimony demands or property disputes. The moving truck arrived Friday morning, and I supervised the loading with the same attention to detail I brought to equipment installations, making sure nothing of Felicia's was accidentally packed while leaving behind anything that might give her ammunition for future contact attempts. I kept my professional tools, technical books, and personal items that had meaning independent of our relationship, but left the wedding gifts, shared furniture, and photographs that represented a partnership I no longer wanted to remember. The house felt empty but not sad when I walked through it one final time, just a space where someone else had lived, and I locked the door without looking back or waiting for Felicia to return from whatever romantic weekend she was probably spending with Marcus. Portland welcomed me with gray skies and practical people who cared more about competence than social connections, and I found a furnished apartment near the company campus where I could focus on work without the distractions of decorating or establishing a social presence. My new colleagues were impressed by my emergency communication system designs and treated me like a valuable addition to their team rather than someone to pity or analyze, which felt like stepping into a version of my life where my professional skills mattered more than personal drama. I learned later through my attorney that Felicia had initially celebrated her freedom, telling everyone who would listen that she'd finally escaped a boring marriage and found someone who matched her ambition, but her confidence started wavering when she realized I wasn't going to fight for her attention or beg for reconciliation. She'd apparently expected me to call, to show up at her office, to make some kind of dramatic gesture that would confirm her importance in my life, but my complete silence left her with nothing to reject or manipulate. Her attempts to reach out started small, messages sent through mutual friends asking about my well-being, but escalated to direct contact attempts when she discovered I'd changed my phone number and moved across the country without telling anyone our departure timeline. The beautiful thing about disappearing completely is that it forces the other person to confront the reality of their choices without the comfort of your reaction, and apparently Felicia was discovering that victory feels hollow when there's no one left to defeat. Portland became my laboratory for rebuilding everything from scratch, starting with the emergency communication system that had been consuming my thoughts since before my marriage imploded. The satellite office gave me access to cutting-edge equipment and brilliant colleagues who shared my obsession with solving complex technical problems, and I threw myself into developing a revolutionary emergency response network with the single-minded focus that had always driven my best work. My project involved creating satellites that could establish communication networks during natural disasters when traditional infrastructure failed, something that required innovations in signal processing, power management, and orbital mechanics that pushed the boundaries of current technology. I deliberately avoided any publicity or social media presence during development, working in complete secrecy with two exceptional engineers I'd met through professional networks rather than company politics. David Chen was a former NASA propulsion specialist who understood orbital mechanics better than anyone I'd ever worked with, and Maria Santos was a signal processing genius who could design algorithms that made impossible things routine. We formed a small startup using my divorce settlement and savings as seed funding, focusing entirely on innovation rather than the flashy presentations and investor pitches that had always made me uncomfortable. The work consumed my days and most of my evenings, but it felt purposeful in ways that marriage counseling and social obligations never had, like I was finally using my skills for something that could genuinely matter to people whose lives depended on reliable communication systems. We operated out of a converted warehouse space in an industrial district where nobody cared about our lack of marketing budget or social media presence. Just 3 engineers solving problems that established aerospace companies had dismissed as unsolvable. The breakthrough came 8 months after I'd moved to Portland, when we successfully tested a prototype satellite that could establish emergency networks using 1/3 the power requirements of existing systems while maintaining signal strength over much larger geographical areas. Our innovation involved a new approach to frequency modulation that allowed multiple emergency services to share bandwidth without interference, something that could revolutionize disaster response coordination but required manufacturing techniques that didn't exist yet. I spent weeks developing the fabrication processes we'd need to build the components, working with local electronics manufacturers who were excited to be part of something genuinely innovative rather than just producing variations of existing technology. Meanwhile, Felicia's relationship with Marcus was apparently falling apart in spectacular fashion, though I only learned this through my attorney when she started making increasingly desperate attempts to contact me through legal channels. Marcus had been using their affair to damage my professional reputation and steal clients from our former company, something Felicia discovered when she realized he was more interested in revenge against me than building anything substantial with her. She'd thought she was upgrading to someone with bigger ambitions and better business connections, but Marcus turned out to be exactly what I'd always known him to be, someone who preferred destroying other people's work to creating anything worthwhile himself. Her attempts to gather information about my activities became increasingly frantic as she realized I wasn't just hiding from her but had actually disappeared into a world where her opinions and connections meant nothing. She started reaching out to my family members, former colleagues, and even college friends, desperately trying to piece together what I was doing and whether I was as miserable as she apparently needed me to be. My parents, following instructions I'd given them months earlier, politely declined to share any information about my new life, and my former Minneapolis colleagues knew only that I'd transferred to another office and seemed to be thriving professionally. The most satisfying part was knowing that while she was spending her energy trying to monitor my activities and validate her choices, I was actually building something that could change how emergency responders saved lives during natural disasters. Our patent applications were filed under the company name rather than my personal identity, making them impossible to find unless someone knew exactly what to search for, and we deliberately avoided any press coverage or industry announcements that might connect our innovations back to my previous work. David and Maria became genuine friends in addition to brilliant collaborators, people who appreciated my methodical approach to problem solving and shared my belief that the best engineering happens away from spotlights and social media attention. We spent weekends hiking in the Oregon mountains, discussing technical challenges and future projects while surrounded by landscapes that reminded me why I'd always preferred natural beauty to urban networking events. Portland's culture suited me perfectly, filled with people who valued competence over connections and measured success by work quality rather than social media followings. I found myself genuinely happy for the first time in years, working on projects that excited me while surrounded by people who shared my values and appreciated my contributions without needing constant entertainment. The irony wasn't lost on me that Felicia's prediction about my lack of ambition was proving spectacularly wrong, but in ways she'd never understand because she'd always confused ambition with self-promotion and innovation with marketing. I was building something that could genuinely matter to the world, working with people who shared that vision, and doing it all without the drama and manipulation that had characterized my marriage. The emergency communication system was becoming everything I'd hoped it could be, and my personal life was finally aligned with my professional values in ways that felt sustainable and authentic rather than performative. Our prototype testing revealed capabilities that exceeded our most optimistic projections, with signal reliability above 95% even in extreme weather conditions that disabled conventional networks. The manufacturing process we developed could produce satellites at 60% of traditional costs while delivering twice the operational lifespan, innovations with potential applications far beyond emergency services. Major telecommunications companies were starting to notice our patent filings, though they had no idea who was behind the designs that were reshaping industry standards for satellite communication efficiency. I deliberately kept my name off all public documentation, operating through our corporate entity and letting David handle external communications that required personal interaction. The anonymity felt liberating, allowing me to focus entirely on technical excellence without the distractions of personal branding that had always felt hollow. Maria developed algorithms that could dynamically route emergency communications based on real-time disaster conditions, requiring artificial intelligence capabilities we built from scratch rather than licensing existing technology. Our system could automatically prioritize communication channels, allocate bandwidth to overwhelmed regions, and maintain stability even when multiple disaster sites competed for resources simultaneously. Meanwhile, Felicia's investigation into my activities had escalated from casual inquiries to what my attorney described as borderline harassment, with multiple attempts to gather information about my whereabouts and professional activities through mutual contacts. She'd apparently convinced herself that I was either secretly successful or completely destitute, unable to accept that I might simply be building a life that didn't revolve around her opinions. Her friends reported that she'd become obsessed with monitoring aerospace industry publications and patent databases, searching for any mention of innovations that might be connected to my work, though our corporate filings made such searches essentially impossible. Marcus had abandoned her within 6 months, apparently losing interest once he'd damaged my reputation and stolen the clients he'd targeted, leaving Felicia heartbroken and humiliated. 18 months after leaving Minneapolis, our startup achieved the breakthrough that would change everything, though I made sure my personal involvement remained completely invisible to anyone monitoring aerospace industry developments. The emergency satellite network we developed successfully passed all federal testing requirements and earned patents for 3 revolutionary innovations in signal processing, power management, and orbital positioning that established new industry standards. NASA approved our system for integration with their disaster response protocols, and major telecommunications companies began licensing our technology for commercial applications, generating revenue streams that transformed our small startup into a significant player in emergency communications. I deliberately structured all agreements to keep my name out of press releases, public announcements, and industry publications, operating through our corporate entity while David and Maria handled any external communications that required personal appearances or media interviews. The financial success allowed me to purchase a beautiful modernist house in the Oregon Hills overlooking the Columbia River, a place designed for someone who appreciated clean lines, natural materials, and views of landscapes that changed with the seasons rather than social status markers. The house felt like a reflection of who I'd become rather than who I'd been trying to impress, with space for a proper home office, workshop areas for prototype development, and windows that framed the kind of natural beauty I'd always preferred to urban networking venues. It was there that I met Alexandra during a sustainable architecture conference I attended to learn about environmentally conscious building techniques that might apply to satellite manufacturing processes. Alexandra was 28, an environmental systems architect who designed buildings that worked with natural ecosystems rather than against them, and our conversation about integrated design philosophy lasted until the conference center closed around us. She understood the satisfaction of solving complex technical problems and shared my belief that the best innovations happened when form followed function rather than market trends or social media appeal. Our relationship developed naturally around shared interests in hiking, sustainable technology, and the kind of quiet conversations that explored ideas rather than gossip, and I found myself genuinely excited about someone's company for the first time since my marriage had ended. Alexandra appreciated my methodical approach to problem solving and my preference for building things that lasted rather than creating impressive facades, and she never made me feel like I needed to justify my personality or apologize for being thorough. We spent weekends exploring Oregon's mountains and coastline, discussing everything from orbital mechanics to ecological restoration while surrounded by landscapes that reminded me why I'd always preferred natural beauty to manufactured social environments. The contrast between Alexandra's authentic interest in my work and Felicia's performative attention couldn't have been starker, and I realized I'd been settling for someone who tolerated my passions rather than someone who genuinely shared them. Meanwhile, Felicia's financial situation had apparently deteriorated significantly after Marcus abandoned her, and her career suffered from the professional damage caused by her public behavior at our company gala. She'd been forced to take a significant step down in her legal career, accepting a position at a smaller firm for substantially less money while dealing with the debt Marcus had apparently helped her accumulate during their brief relationship. Her desperate attempts to gather information about my activities had escalated to what my attorney described as harassment, with multiple attempts to contact my family, former colleagues, and even Alexandra through professional networks after somehow discovering we were dating. She'd apparently convinced herself that I was either secretly successful or living in poverty, unable to accept that I might simply be building a life that didn't require her validation or involvement. Her investigation into aerospace industry developments had become obsessive according to mutual friends who reported that she spent hours analyzing patent databases, technology news sites, and industry publications, searching for any mention of innovations that might be connected to my work. The fact that our corporate structure and patent filings made such connections impossible only intensified her frustration, and she'd started reaching out to aerospace professionals in Portland, claiming to be researching emergency communication systems for potential legal clients. Alexandra found Felicia's behavior more amusing than threatening, pointing out that someone who was truly confident in their choices wouldn't need to monitor their ex-husband's activities so closely. She was right, of course, and her calm confidence in our relationship made Felicia's desperate attempts to insert herself into my new life seem even more pathetic and irrelevant. The success of our emergency communication system had attracted attention from federal agencies and international organizations interested in disaster response capabilities, though all publicity focused on our corporate achievements rather than individual contributors. I watched our technology being discussed in industry publications and government reports with the satisfaction of knowing I'd built something genuinely useful while maintaining the anonymity that allowed me to focus on innovation rather than personal promotion. The financial rewards were substantial but secondary to the professional satisfaction of seeing emergency responders using our technology to coordinate more effective disaster relief efforts, and I knew that even if Felicia eventually discovered my involvement, her opinion no longer mattered to the life I was building. Alexandra and I had begun discussing marriage in the abstract way that happy couples do, talking about shared values, future goals, and the kind of partnership we both wanted to build together. Her approach to relationships was as thoughtful and intentional as her approach to architecture, based on solid foundations rather than impressive facades, and I found myself genuinely excited about planning a future with someone who appreciated both my professional achievements and personal character. The moment that changed everything came 2 years after I'd walked out of that Minneapolis ballroom, when our emergency satellite system was selected as the Breakthrough Technology of the Year at the Pacific Northwest Aerospace Achievement Awards in Seattle. The ceremony was one of those industry events I'd always avoided, but our corporate investors insisted that someone from our team needed to accept the recognition, and David and Maria convinced me it was time to step out of the shadows and claim credit for the innovation that was revolutionizing emergency communications. I'd spent so long operating in anonymity that the idea of public recognition felt strange, but Alexandra pointed out that my work deserved acknowledgement and that hiding my achievements only gave more power to people like Felicia who'd tried to diminish them. The federal contract announcement had made national technology news when our system was selected for integration with FEMA's Disaster Response Network, representing a multi-million-dollar validation of the innovations we developed in our converted warehouse space. The awards ceremony took place at the Seattle Convention Center, filled with aerospace industry leaders, federal contractors, and technology journalists who covered developments in satellite communications and emergency response systems. I wore the first expensive suit I'd bought since my divorce, standing beside Alexandra, who looked stunning in a dress she'd chosen because it made her feel confident rather than because it impressed other people. The contrast between this moment and the company gala where Felicia had humiliated me couldn't have been more complete, surrounded by people who respected my technical expertise rather than questioning my professional value. When our company name was announced as the winner, I walked to the podium with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your work speaks for itself rather than needing to prove your worth through social performance. My acceptance speech focused on the collaborative nature of innovation and the importance of building technology that served emergency responders rather than just generating profits, themes that resonated with an audience of engineers and public safety professionals. The industry publication photographers captured the moment when I held the award while describing how our satellite network had already helped coordinate disaster relief efforts in 3 major hurricane response operations. Video clips of my presentation went viral within aerospace circles, shared by emergency management professionals who'd seen our technology perform under extreme conditions and federal officials who recognized the strategic value of reliable disaster communications. Alexandra stood in the front row, beaming with genuine pride in my achievements, and I realized that this was what supportive partnership actually looked like rather than the performative relationship I'd mistaken for love during my marriage. The coverage included detailed profiles of our innovation process, my background in aerospace systems engineering, and the methodical approach that had enabled us to solve problems that established companies had dismissed as unsolvable. Within hours of the ceremony, the news had reached Minneapolis through industry networks and social media connections that I'd never considered when I'd focused purely on technical excellence rather than personal publicity. The irony wasn't lost on me that Felicia's prediction about my lack of ambition was being disproven in the most public way possible, broadcast to the exact professional community where she tried to damage my reputation. My former colleagues from the Minneapolis office saw the coverage and immediately began sharing congratulations and industry articles highlighting the breakthrough achievements of someone they'd watched quietly leave after his wife's public humiliation. The story gained additional traction when technology journalists discovered that the innovative satellite network transforming emergency communications had been developed by the same engineer whose marriage had ended in such spectacular fashion at a Minneapolis company gala 2 years earlier. Industry insiders began connecting the dots between my departure from Minneapolis, the secretive startup that had revolutionized emergency communications, and the quiet engineer who'd preferred building solutions to building social media presence. The narrative that emerged was exactly what I'd hoped to avoid but probably inevitable. A story about perseverance, technical excellence, and the kind of success that comes from focusing on substance rather than style. Alexandra and I celebrated quietly that evening at a Portland restaurant where we could discuss the day's events without being surrounded by industry networking and social media documentation of our personal lives. She pointed out that the recognition was validation not just of my technical work but of the decision to leave a toxic situation and build something authentic rather than trying to fix a relationship that had already been destroyed by selfishness and manipulation. The transformation from the humiliated husband walking out of a Minneapolis ballroom to the confident innovator accepting national recognition for breakthrough technology felt surreal, but also inevitable in the way that genuine achievements often do when you've done the work consistently over time. I realized that the best revenge really was success, not because it hurt the people who'd wronged you, but because it proved that their opinions had never mattered as much as they'd wanted you to believe. The media coverage continued for weeks, with industry publications analyzing our innovation process, federal officials discussing the strategic implications of improved emergency communications, and technology investors recognizing the commercial potential of our patent portfolio. My name was finally attached to the achievements I'd been building in anonymity, but the recognition felt earned rather than desperate, based on actual accomplishments rather than social media performance or networking manipulation. The success was especially satisfying because it represented exactly the kind of methodical, technically focused approach that Felicia had criticized as lacking ambition, proving that substance-based achievement was more sustainable than the flashy presentation style she'd preferred. Within a week of the Aerospace Award ceremony, Felicia launched what could only be described as a desperate reconciliation campaign that revealed just how completely she'd misunderstood both my character and the life I'd built without her. She started by showing up unannounced at our Portland office, somehow tracking down our company address through industry publications and demanding to speak with me about what she called unfinished business between us. Our security team politely but firmly refused her entry when she couldn't provide a legitimate business reason for the visit, explaining that all communications needed to go through proper channels rather than surprise appearances that disrupted our workplace. Her response to this professional boundary was to create a series of social media posts apologizing for what she termed our mutual misunderstanding, praising my recent success, and suggesting that she'd always known I had the potential for great achievements. She tagged our company's LinkedIn page, my professional contacts, and even Alexandra's architectural firm in an obvious attempt to force some kind of response or acknowledgement from me. The posts were carefully crafted to present herself as the supportive ex-wife who'd always believed in my capabilities, conveniently omitting her public prediction that I'd never amount to anything without her family's connections or her cruel dismissal of my work as elaborate tinkering. Her revisionist history portrayed our marriage as a partnership where she'd encouraged my ambitions rather than undermined them, and suggested that any problems had been mutual miscommunications rather than her deliberate cruelty and infidelity. The most disturbing escalation came when she reached out to Alexandra through professional networks, claiming she had important information about my past that my current partner deserved to know before making any serious relationship commitments. She presented herself as concerned about Alexandra's well-being rather than jealous about my happiness, suggesting that I had emotional issues stemming from our divorce that might affect future relationships. Alexandra handled these manipulation attempts with the calm professionalism I'd come to admire, forwarding the messages to me while noting that anyone resorting to such tactics was obviously not someone whose opinions should be taken seriously. Her confidence in our relationship and her ability to see through Felicia's desperate maneuvering made the contrast between authentic partnership and manipulative behavior even more obvious. My response came through my attorney, who issued a comprehensive cease and desist order documenting Felicia's harassment attempts and making it clear that any further contact with me, my company, or my personal relationships would result in legal action for stalking and workplace disruption. The order specifically mentioned her unauthorized appearance at our office, her social media campaign designed to force unwanted contact, and her inappropriate outreach to Alexandra as examples of behavior that had crossed legal boundaries. My lawyer structured the document to demonstrate a pattern of escalating harassment that could support restraining order proceedings if necessary, while giving Felicia one final opportunity to cease her attempts at forced reconciliation. The legal intervention had the intended effect of stopping direct contact attempts, but Felicia's public apology posts and desperate attempts to insert herself into my success story remained visible on social media platforms where mutual contacts could witness her opportunistic behavior. Industry colleagues who remembered her cruel predictions about my lack of potential could now see her trying to claim partial credit for achievements she'd actively discouraged, creating a public record of her manipulation that damaged her credibility more effectively than any revenge I could have planned. Her social media activity became increasingly erratic as she realized that her attempts to force reconciliation were being ignored and that her public rehabilitation campaign was backfiring among people who remembered her original behavior. She began posting inspirational quotes about forgiveness, second chances, and the importance of supporting your partner's dreams. Messages that rang hollow coming from someone who'd publicly humiliated her husband at his own company event. The desperation became obvious to anyone following her social media presence, as she shifted from subtle hints about past relationships to increasingly direct references to successful ex-partners and the mistakes people make when they don't appreciate what they have. Her attempts to present herself as the reformed woman who'd learned important lessons about love and partnership were undermined by the timing, which made it clear that her enlightenment had coincided suspiciously with my public recognition and financial success rather than genuine personal growth. Meanwhile, Alexandra and I continued building our relationship based on mutual respect and shared values, completely unaffected by Felicia's attempts to create drama or insert herself into our happiness. We'd started discussing engagement seriously, not because we needed to prove anything to outside observers, but because we genuinely wanted to build a life together based on the authentic partnership we'd discovered. Alexandra found the entire situation more amusing than threatening, pointing out that Felicia's behavior demonstrated exactly why I was better off without her and that anyone willing to go to such lengths to reclaim something they'd voluntarily discarded obviously had serious judgment issues. Her calm confidence in our relationship and her ability to dismiss Felicia's manipulation attempts without drama or insecurity made me appreciate even more what genuine partnership looked like compared to the toxic dynamics I'd escaped. The contrast between Alexandra's mature response to unwanted interference and Felicia's desperate attempts to force herself back into my life highlighted the difference between someone who was secure in themselves versus someone who needed external validation to feel worthwhile. Our mutual friends from Minneapolis who witnessed both Felicia's original cruelty and her current desperation began reaching out to express their amazement at how completely the situation had reversed, with several mentioning that they'd always thought Felicia had made a terrible mistake but hadn't expected her to demonstrate it so publicly. The final chapter of this story began 6 months later when Tech Innovation Weekly published a comprehensive feature about our company titled, From Quiet Engineer to Aerospace Innovator, The Zachary Mitchell Story, which detailed my journey from developing emergency communication systems in corporate anonymity to revolutionizing disaster response technology through methodical innovation and persistent problem-solving. The article included interviews with federal emergency management officials who described how our satellite network had already saved lives during hurricane evacuations, wildfire communications, and earthquake relief efforts, positioning our technology as a strategic national asset rather than just another commercial product. The publication chose to include subtle references to overcoming personal betrayals and professional setbacks, with industry insiders immediately recognizing the connection to my highly publicized divorce and the Minneapolis company gala incident that had become something of a cautionary tale about workplace behavior. The feature story gained significant traction in aerospace circles and was picked up by several other technology publications, creating exactly the kind of sustained positive coverage that established my reputation as someone who transformed personal adversity into professional breakthrough through dedication and authentic innovation rather than social media manipulation or networking politics. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, as Alexandra and I had just gotten engaged during a quiet moment at our Oregon home, surrounded by the life of genuine success and partnership that represented everything I'd learned about what actually mattered in building a sustainable future. Felicia apparently couldn't resist making one final desperate attempt to insert herself into this narrative when she learned about the Seattle Technology Summit, where I was scheduled to deliver the keynote presentation about emergency communication innovation to an audience of industry leaders, federal officials, and technology journalists. She somehow obtained access credentials to the conference, possibly through professional connections or by claiming research purposes, and positioned herself in the main auditorium where my presentation was being broadcast live to aerospace industry networks worldwide. The moment that became legendary in our professional circles occurred when she approached me immediately after my presentation, pushing through the crowd of legitimate attendees and colleagues who were discussing technical applications and future collaboration opportunities. In front of multiple cameras that were still recording post-presentation interviews, she loudly announced that we needed to talk privately about our shared history and the role she'd played in supporting my early career development, clearly hoping to force some kind of public acknowledgement or dramatic scene that would insert her into the coverage of my professional achievements. My response was captured perfectly by the live streaming cameras and became an instant classic in professional networking circles. I looked at her calmly, said, "I don't believe we have anything to discuss," in the same measured tone I'd used to decline an irrelevant technical proposal, and continued my conversation with a NASA administrator about satellite deployment strategies while security personnel professionally escorted her away from the media area. The video clip went viral within hours, not because of any drama or confrontation, but because it perfectly demonstrated the kind of professional dignity and emotional freedom that comes from building authentic success rather than seeking validation from people whose opinions have become irrelevant. Industry colleagues who'd witnessed both her original cruelty at the Minneapolis gala and her desperate attempts to reclaim relevance recognized the complete reversal of power dynamics, with several noting that she'd become exactly the kind of person who begged for attention from someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The contrast between my calm confidence while discussing genuine achievements with respected colleagues and her desperate attempt to force herself into a conversation where she had no legitimate place became a perfect example of how authentic success speaks for itself while desperation only highlights its own emptiness. The story concluded exactly as it should have, with Alexandra and me planning our wedding while surrounded by friends and colleagues who appreciated our partnership for what it was rather than what it represented in terms of social status or professional advancement. We decided on a small ceremony at our Oregon home, focusing on the commitment we were making to each other rather than creating an event designed to impress people whose opinions didn't matter to our actual happiness. The final irony was that Felicia's prediction about my never amounting to anything without her connections had been proven wrong in the most public way possible, broadcast to the exact professional community where she'd tried to damage my reputation, while I'd achieved everything through the methodical technical approach she'd dismissed as lacking ambition. I found myself genuinely grateful for her decision to leave, not because I wanted revenge or vindication, but because her betrayal had forced me to discover what I was actually capable of achieving when I stopped trying to accommodate someone who fundamentally didn't respect who I was. The emergency communication system we developed was being integrated into disaster response protocols worldwide, our patents were licensing to major telecommunications companies, and most importantly, I was building a life with someone who appreciated both my professional achievements and personal character without needing me to apologize for either. Industry colleagues who knew the whole story often mentioned that they'd never seen such a complete transformation from personal devastation to professional triumph, but I knew that the real victory wasn't proving Felicia wrong about my potential, it was discovering that her opinion had never mattered as much as she'd wanted me to believe. The aerospace industry had embraced our innovations not because of social connections or networking politics, but because we'd solved problems that actually needed solving, using the kind of methodical engineering approach that prioritized substance over style and results over recognition. Looking back, I realized that Felicia's betrayal had been the catalyst for discovering my authentic capabilities rather than the limitation she'd intended it to be, forcing me to build something genuine rather than trying to maintain relationships that were fundamentally incompatible with who I actually was. The life Alexandra and I were creating together represented everything I'd learned about what authentic partnership looked like: mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from building something real rather than performing something impressive for external validation.